Passenger locomotives were in their heyday during the 1920s, with large numbers of Americans utilizing trains as their most convenient option for traveling medium to long distances. Over the next decade, however, train travel was beginning to become slowly overtaken by both airplane and automobile options, which were heavily subsidized by the government to get them rolling. These subsidies weren't extended to trains though, so those invested in their success had to come up with new and exciting ways to indulge their potential clientele. This led to luxury options being extended to a large variety of locomotives and streamlined passenger trains. Passenger cars with fully equipped air conditioning, major upgrades to dining cars, and an overall refurbished and sleek look, to launch the perception of trains from an antiquated, convenient mode of travel into a futuristic and ultra-luxurious experience. On top of this, with air and vehicle travel still ironing out some early kinks and undergoing constant innovation, tried and true train travel was considered an ultimately safe alternative. This brings us to the topic of today's video. The streamlined passenger train introduced in 1936 known as the City of San Francisco. This state-of-the-art train was America's most luxurious streamliner and had connecting routes between Oakland, California and Chicago, Illinois, while also having a terminal in the namesake city of San Francisco. It cost $2 million to build and had everything the modern business-class American could want. It provided premium extra fare service, and the route from Chicago to San Francisco clocked in at 39 hours and 45 minutes each way. Thanks to its top-of-the-line horsepower, it shaved 19 hours off the typical mid to west coast trip. For its first 3 years of service, this locomotive was highly used and extremely well regarded by almost all of its patrons. That is, until one fateful day in 1939. The city of San Francisco was 30 minutes late when it pulled out of Carlin, Nevada on the evening of August 12, 1939. Its engineer, Ed Hecox, was aware that the train was behind schedule, but he knew the area extremely well. He had been transporting passengers through the West since he was a stagecoach driver in the 1880s. There was a long, empty stretch of Nevada that would give him plenty of space to make up the lost time. It was in this stretch that he pushed the train from its normal operating speed of around 50 miles per hour, all the way up to 90. And the passengers had noticed the large change in speed, but they were mostly unperturbed. Dinner service had just wrapped up in the restaurant car, and many patrons were enjoying post-meal drinks. And during the occasional turns, some loose beer bottles would fall to the ground while the train banked around the curves. One woman was even flung from her seat, but there wasn't cause for concern. The passengers simply laughed as she regained her composure. At 9:33 p.m., while speeding toward Bridge Number 4 over the Humboldt River Gorge, Ed Hecox saw a tumbleweed on the left rail of the track. It caught his attention but wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Until, when he had reached this section of the track, he felt a jarring shift in the momentum of the train. He braked as hard as he could, but it was too late. The city of San Francisco was derailing. The front engines were propelled by momentum and slid off the rails but kept going across the bridge. Behind them, 5 train cars broke loose and decoupled. A 32-seat coffee shop or kitchen car, a 72-seat dining car, a lounge car, and 2 sleeper units plunged through the wooden track ties into the riverbed below. Ed Hecox later recalled that his first thought was wondering how many had just died in the disaster. When the smoke had settled, there were 24 dead and countless more injured with the twisted wreckage. Survivors crawled through the carnage, passing body parts torn apart by the impact. Stewardesses bravely helped passengers escape the derailed train cars, putting the lives of others before their very own. The accident occurred past dark, leaving maimed and confused passengers scrambling aimlessly through the pitch black of night. They began to set parts of the train on fire just for light to navigate their way to the exits. As soon as the train had fully halted, Hecox began running for the closest town to gather help. There was nothing in between his train and the nearest town, No telephones and no people. He finally arrived at Harney and raised the alarm about what had happened. A large group of volunteers followed Heacox back to the crash site, where nearly all of the 170 people aboard were injured. It was the start of a long night for everybody involved, as the first rescue train wouldn't arrive until the morning. Alongside the rescue train came a slew of investigators from the railroad, local law enforcement, and even the FBI. It didn't take long before they discovered that the cause of the derailment was sabotage. A 30-foot section of rail had been tampered with. Its spikes were pulled out so the rail could be forced inward, and the tumbleweed that Heacox saw had been tied onto the rail to hide the gap. Brown paint also coated the area in an attempt to disguise the vandalism. Whoever had decided to sabotage the rails must have premeditated the plan long in advance. It required that a 1,500-pound rail be moved 5 inches from its position and spiked back down. Alongside this, there was only a 4-hour window in between when the last train had crossed the bridge and the time of the city of San Francisco's derailment. Because of this, it's believed that the crime was committed by a determined group of individuals rather than a lone miscreant. Although this information was immediately obvious, detectives went about rounding up a larger number of hobos and men that were made homeless by the Great Depression in efforts to find their culprit. A reward of $5,000 was placed for information that would lead to the arrest of the saboteurs. That's pretty much over $100,000 in today's modern equivalent. Over multiple years, an astonishing 93,000 people were interviewed by detectives in a massive effort to crack the case. Despite the overwhelming effort, the saboteurs were never found, and their motives were never unveiled. Outside of a civil suit in the 1940s that yielded payouts for some injured passengers, the survivors of the city of San Francisco derailment received no other justice for the atrocity. One of these survivors, F.S. Foote Jr., suffered a broken jaw and sternum, a punctured lung, internal hemorrhaging, a concussion, and cracked ribs. He was awarded a $7,500 from the civil suit, which was just enough to pay his hospital bills. He later told newspapers that the South Pacific, the railroad responsible for overseeing the city of San Francisco, gave him a measly $5, which covered the additional fare that he had paid to upgrade his ticket. He received a letter that stated the following: "While technically a refund of only the value of the unused portion of the ticket would be in order, we are refunding the full amount of the extra fare due to the interruption to our service. Trust that we shall have the pleasure of serving you in the future." How incredibly generous. To this day, the derailment of the city of San Francisco remains a mystery. It's not believed to have been any sort of concerted terrorist effort, as no group ever claimed responsibility for the act. The leading theory is that it was the work of several men who had a grudge against either the Southern Pacific Railroad or an individual aboard the train, though the truth may never come to light. In 1995, a magazine titled SP Trainline published a story detailing the events of the city of San Francisco. Only a week later, Amtrak's Sunset Limited passenger train traveling from Miami to Los Angeles derailed in the Arizona desert. One crew member was killed. The scene was eerily similar. A westbound train traveling through the desert at night deliberately sabotaged at the approach to a bridge, sending the train into a riverbed below. It's believed that the saboteurs were inspired by the article and story of the 1939 derailment, leading them to perform a copycat crime. Much like its sister derailment from over 50 years prior, the culprits were never found. What are your thoughts on these derailments? Do you think these saboteurs had any specific motivations outside of just causing pure chaos? Was it perhaps a vendetta against one or some of the other passengers on board? And let me know in the comments below. And continue letting me know if you have any other topics you would like me to cover. I love reading all your suggestions. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you back here next week with another mystery.